And I would like to focus on those moments where you say there were strange grammatical structures and the tenses change, and it just reads as a little abrupt in ways that a lot of other translations don't bring to readers in the target language. Uh, I think you've said elsewhere that one aspect of your translation is you do the police in different voices, and this does strike you. There are different voices throughout. Just to use Mark as an example, the word immediately appears frequently throughout the first chapter of Mark, not just in your translation, but in other translations as well. Your translation, however, gives that immediacy a whole new life with these bizarre grammatical constructions at times. For example, in Mark chapter 1, verse 30, your translation reads, "And Simon's mother-in-law was laid out, stricken with fever, and immediately they tell him about her." And it sounds almost like how New Yorkers talk, So I says to him this, and then he tells me this, and that.
Well, to be
What?
honest, everyone talks that way when they're telling stories from the past. There's for generations, New Testament scholars have been taught that this thing called the historic past was a normal stylistic device that to the people of the time sounded like a past tense or didn't seem out of place. This is nonsense. That was based on the misapplication of philological work that was true 5 or 6 centuries earlier in Greek. It has no systematic application to what's going on in the first century Kimi of the New Testament. What's really going on there is much more interesting. In the ancient world, of course, you didn't sit down and write a book. You dictated a book to an amanuensis. There were only very few persons who've been able to practice handwriting and who had the materials and the skills. You composed by speaking. So Luke, who's a very educated person, writes in a syngrammatic style, to use a term I've invented just to scare the philologists, which is he's writing like a treatise, and there the tenses are regular and uniform and very much as we would use them today if you were to sit down and write an historical narrative. But the other three are living voices captured by an amanuensis who's transcribing with sort of like the fidelity of a dictaphone. And if you suppress this tense changes, I think you do great damage to the text because they were not systematic. They are exactly as you say. It's the way we tell a story when we're say among our friends. I went to see my girlfriend. I went up and knocked on her door, and she comes to the door there with a knife in her hand. And I step back. The shift in
You're
tense.
relating stories of my recent past, but that's fine. That might just be providential.
I think that I can imagine, yeah, looking at you, I can see how that might be. But it's something we do intuitively, spontaneously, unsystematically. But for that very reason, it's expressive, and as opposed to the syngrammatic style of Luke, it's what you might call a phrastic style, just an expressive style, and it captures the voice of someone who was not a scholar, not a writer, not a particularly educated man, probably. And in the case of Mark, I tried to capture the terseness and the abruptness and the brokenness of the prose by trying to keep the English as terse as the Greek, which is kind of hard to do, but I think at places I succeeded.
What does it tell us? Obviously, I understand the purpose to it. I see its use in English as well as what I assume to be its use in Koine Greek. What does it tell us about the experience of the text? How people would have experienced this text in the first and second centuries, and how Christians today, genial, regular old American Christians, what it does to our experience of that scripture and maybe our experience of faith to get it in this urgency and to get it in this immediate language.
Well, I think the immediacy of the voice is instructive in two ways. One, it reminds us of how the early Christians heard these stories. They would have been read out. Just as you didn't sit down to write, you didn't sit down to read for the most part. These were heard. And so little devices that many translators remove, like in Matthew and all of them, but Matthew especially, says, "Idu, look." In the Old King James, that's behold, which even at the time was a somewhat hieratically ornamental term, not quite appropriate. But the look actually goes along with the style of hearing, the manner in which the text was heard. It was almost like reading to a room full of children today. Look, here comes a bunny. Only in this case, the bunny is a Magian from a Parthian priest bearing gifts for the king. But at the same time, also, the immediacy seems to me, and I find this even more in Paul than in the gospel writers. There is an urgency there. There is a vitality there, as if somebody who's not really a gifted writer, not an educated man, is attempting to communicate something that has gripped him with absolute and undeniable power. And I think even in translating, even though I've been reading the Greek since I was a boy, because I had the luxury of a classical education, in translating, it struck me again just how extraordinarily passionate, urgent, immediate, what a sense I got from the text of men who would not necessarily have written anything at all if they didn't feel they had something very vital to communicate that they had experienced at a very deep level.
I'd like to talk about Paul. You write, quote, "The relation between Christian theology and scriptural translation has a long and complicated history. Theology has not only influenced translation, but particular translations have had enormous consequences for the development of theology. It would be almost impossible, for instance, to exaggerate how consequential the Latin Vulgate's inept rendering of a single verse, Romans 5:12, proved for the development of the Western Christian understanding of original sin." Now, in the ESV, that verse reads, "Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, so death spread to all men because all sinned." The KJV renders it just about the same. "So death passed upon all men for all that have sinned." Instead of the ESV or the KJV, the DBH translation, your translation, reads, "Therefore, just as sin entered into the cosmos through one man, and death through sin, so all death pervaded all humanity, whereupon," at which point, as if to say, all sinned. You've also criticized the American Protestant understanding of Paul. To use your words, how does the genial Presbyterian get Paul so wrong?
Well, you've just asked about 12 different.
You can answer them in any order you prefer.
I mean, I want to point out that the ESV and the KJV translations also don't quite capture what happened in the Vulgate, which is what had the theological consequences. In the Vulgate, that last phrase becomes "in quo omnes peccaverunt," in whom all sinned. And because the pronoun quo had retained the masculine form of the Greek pronoun, ho pantes, but the prior noun in the Latin went from being male, thanatos, to female, or feminine, masculine to feminine. Mors, what in the Greek looks like a reference to death becomes a reference to Adam. And with a different preposition, it seems to be saying that we in Adam sinned. Now, from the time of Augustine right up through the Council of Trent, when these issues were defined in Roman theology, that is the only verse that is routinely cited as evidence of an inheritance of original guilt. And it's simply it's one of the large differences between Eastern and Western Christianity, that in the East the idea of original sin has no notion of an inherited culpability, and I would argue that's an illogical notion in any event. It's like a square, a circle. The notion that you can inherit guilt. So there isn't the same rather grim Augustinian picture of humanity born as a massa damnanda, already damnably guilty in the eyes of God. If you want a nice chilling picture of the direction in which that kind of a language can go, I can cite you some passages both from Augustine and Calvin that would keep you up at night. As for the other thing, I would say that the Protestant, it's not just the Protestant. I mean, Paul is a difficult figure to deal with, but the more removed the Christian thought came from the age in which he lived, and the special concerns that tormented him, and the intertestamental literature that he read, the further we moved from appreciating what's most important in his theology, and a new emphasis arose. I mean, most Protestants, being inheritors of a late Augustinian tradition, think that Paul's principal concern is how we're justified. That is, and by justified, they don't mean really made just or even proved just, but extrinsically, forensically pronounced just through the unmerited grace of Christ's sacrifice, which supposedly pleases the Father, because there he pours out his wrath on sin. Now, none of that's actually in Paul. Some of the language there is based on distortions of Paul. Paul's actual teaching is very different. I mean, the word dikaiosis, or its verbal cognates, doesn't mean justified in that sense. It means literally either vindicated or corrected, made new. And it's actually that aspect of Paul's thought shows up in Galatians and in Romans 9 through 11, because in the first case, he's arguing with new Christians in Galatia from the Gentile world, trying to explain to them that they don't need to obey the law of Moses to be enfolded within the covenant, because the covenant goes back to Abraham, not just to Sinai. And in Romans 9 through 11, one of the most notoriously misread passages in Christian history, Paul's concern is principally how church and Israel are related. Basically, did God forsake his covenant with Israel in embracing the Gentiles? And in the end, he comes to the conclusion, no. He raises the possibility that God created vessels of wrath to show the power of his dereliction when he showed mercy to some and not to others. But then he concludes in chapter 11 that this too is not what's going on. That's a dreadful possibility for Paul. What he concludes is, in fact, as he says quite explicitly, God bound everyone in disobedience so that he could show mercy to everyone. But that's not actually the thing that gets me most about reading Paul, because all of that is those are actually not central concerns for Paul. If you actually go through all the Pauline literature, the definitely authentic epistles, and those that are definitely in his school, even if they aren't directly from his mouth, he's very much a man. He's a Hellenistic Jew of the first century. He believes that he lives in an age that is passing away. Another age is coming, and that this age is under the dominion of ancient angelic powers. That in Christ, these powers on high, and calls them thrones, dominions, principalities, powers, and we don't always appreciate that these are angelic beings who occupy the planetary and stellar spheres in the cosmology of the time and below the earth, have been conquered. That this whole cosmos, and there's a reason why I retain the word cosmos there too, that was enslaved to death and to these mutinous or incompetent or apostate powers, have been conquered. Christ took them captive. He ascended on high. And in 1 Corinthians 15, you get the great synthesis. Ultimately, the whole cosmos having been restored, a new age will dawn in which Christ hands over the cosmos to be directly governed by God, no longer through the intermediate agency of these incompetent or fallen angels. And God will be all in all, and the whole cosmos will be transfigured. This is the burning heart of Paul's theology. It runs through all of his writings, but we tend not to notice it because we don't recognize what the language is. For one thing, even the words principalities, powers, we tend to think he's talking in terms of human political arrangements. And for some reason, even though this is ubiquitous in his writings, we tend to look past it, and especially in the West, I would say. I mean, that's also part of the Western inheritance. The notion of salvation as cosmic conquest was a little bit better preserved in the East. Sorry, I have some time there, but you did, as I say, ask a dozen questions.
And you gave me the answers. I want to get on to the cosmos. It's an excellent place to launch from. because you do maintain some words in your translation that we would not usually see, one of which is cosmos. For instance, instead of blessed are the poor in spirit, you write, how blissful the destitute, abject in spirit. Instead of in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, in John chapter 1, you maintain logos. You say, in the origin there was the logos, and then finally cosmos. Instead of for God so loved the world, as we can all recite, you write, for God so loved the cosmos. What do blissful logos and cosmos offer us that blessed word and world do not?
Yeah, well, what they don't offer you, obviously, is a great deal of literary felicity. I mean, obviously, it leads to a somewhat awkward English. But then again, I'd point out that in none of those cases am I translating good Greek. So the ultimate effect is sort of an even draw. But to me, it's very important. For instance, well, cosmos, let me start there, because that connects to what I was saying about Paul. We use the word world today to mean two things generally. One, the planet we're walking around on. The other, the human world. And by that we mean just the way people are, the moral order, the political arrangements by which they live, the social order. And if we use the word world in our translation, we lose, I think, a vital aspect of the way first century Jews and Christians and pagans saw reality. When the Gospel of John, for instance, talks about Christ as coming from above into the cosmos, he means just that, passing down through all the spheres. Cosmos is an incomparably, it not only does it not merely mean the human world, it doesn't even mean merely the physical world. It includes the world of spirits, of angels. It includes the whole of the heavens, the fixed stars, the planetary spheres, the ethereal realm, the realm, the aerial realm, the subterranean realm. It means the whole of everything, and there is, especially in John and Paul, but also elsewhere, very much a clear narrative structure to their language of salvation. It is about this enclosed reality of an entire cosmos, from the heights to the depths, enslaved to death, being invaded by a divine conqueror, transfigured and redeemed. I think all of that is all. We lose that cosmology, and a lot of the language, especially, say, again, of John, becomes needlessly obscure. Although when you restore it, it becomes rather frighteningly unfamiliar too. When you really look at what the gospel is saying, the way it's imagining the reality in which the story of salvation unfolds, it's an alien picture of reality. So then, of course, we have to adjust. I was trying to say, how does the gospel survive the shift in worldviews?
I'm sorry, please go ahead.
No, just whatever the case, that's the translation decision about which I get the most complaints, not translating cosmos as world, and that's the one on which I'm absolutely most adamant. It is an absolute folly to translate that as world, because it just gives all the wrong impressions by the usage of the word today.
The way that you translate Satan struck me too. All of this language, it being fresh, it being different, it being unfamiliar, is striking, and it makes you approach the gospel in an unfamiliar way. You refer to Satan variously, but by what his name means. The accuser, the slanderer, Satan means the adversary. But you don't do this with all names. So you don't refer to Peter only as the rock or something, which as a matter of translation might conjure up images of Dwayne Johnson weeping bitterly as the cock crows. Why?
Well, I imagine Peter was a lot like Dwayne.
Of course, yeah, he's a pretty burly guy, you know. Why do you translate the name Satan? What is it about the character of Satan, but not other names?
It's not a name, for one thing, and there are two words. And Satan is always translated as accuser. When you see slanderer, the Greek there is diabolos, or diabolos, if you prefer, or diabolos. In proper Greek, you would say diabolos. And these are titles. They're ancient titles. They're not proper names. When it comes to proper names, all proper names have some meaning if you go far back enough. So there's no need to say Peter. Where it's important in Matthew, I note the play on words, on this rock, you know. But in the case of certain titles that have become for us just titles, whose actual meaning, which would have been audible to the first century Christians, has been lost, I restore the meaning, or I translate the meaning rather than retain it as an opaque signifier, so to speak. So I don't use the word Christ either. I use the term the Anointed, or the Anointed One. The Satan, or Satanas, is obviously a figure in Hebrew scripture, but also who changes character somewhat in the intertestamental period. But is basically just that. It means that a prosecuting attorney, basically. Lawyer. Satan is a lawyer. But we knew that, didn't we? Diabolos, well, we have the word devil, which may come from Diabolos. I tend to think it comes from an earlier Indo-European root, like the Teufel or the devil in English come from the same Indo-European roots as the words for deva in the Indo-European language. And that's not important. What is important is Diabolos, the Greek word, it really means a slanderer, or one who divides with false speech. What was the other one you asked about? Makari. Blissful. Now that's interesting. Where the text says evloimenos, evloimenos, I leave the term blessed. But Makarios is an interesting word because it doesn't just mean blessed in the sense that, he's fortunate. Or at least it doesn't have that connotation, or he's comfortable, or he's well off. It has both etymologically and when you see how it's used in texts outside of Scripture, it has a special intensity. It means bliss, and originally meant a bliss akin to that of the gods. And so, it appealed to me to write blissful. Again, now that's an example of a translation. Some people love it, some people hate it. No one seems to be neutral.
I do love it. I love it. The images that it evokes are really, it strikes me really beautifully.
Mark Timothy Johnson said it evoked images of stoners,
well,
which is fine with me. I mean, I was born in the 60s.
I was stoned while I was reading it. Maybe there's some relation there. My final question is not about the age to come, or the age that you were writing about, that you're translating from, the first century or the second century. My question is about this age. You've written extensively about the new atheists, Daniel Dennett, Richard Dawkins. You've rhetorically just smacked them around for years, very powerfully so. It seems to me that they are on the decline. They're in mortal decline, and there is a hunger on campus for some meaning. I think it's why Jordan Peterson's book is selling so well. I think it's why everyone is so sick of the shrieking girl at Yale and all of this.
Peterson is your example, sure.
Well, he's a very popular example. That's why I bring him up. I think this is, there's an age of, I think there's a sense that the only moral thought these days, the only moral framework is if it feels good, do it, and there's no meaning to anything. And so even the suggestion that one ought to make one's bed and clean one's room is earth-shattering to a lot of people. Do you share my hope for this culture right now, for the very near coming age, or do you think we're just going to hell in a handbasket?
Well, okay, let me unpack that. I think you're right that the period of writing about the new atheists was convenient because it meant not having to construct straw men. They more or less built themselves out of straw, and that was a silly group. And that was a publishing fad. I don't know if it was ever quite the movement they imagined it was, but it answered a certain desire for a niche market in publishing. I don't know if there's a new hunger for meaning. I think there's a perennial hunger that expresses itself differently from time to time, from age to age, from period to period. I hope it's not a hunger that Jordan Peterson would be able to fulfill, because I think he's a hack. but a mediocrity who's made a lot of money by doing from a sort of from a different angle, much what a New Age writer would do.
This may be your angle to convert Jordan. I had him on the show, and I tried to get him to announce that he was getting baptized or something. But this is like the good cop, bad cop, maybe. This angle, perhaps yours will work.
My disagreement, I have much profounder. I just think that it's a pastiche of reasonably bad scholarship by a second-rate mind. I don't care what his aims are, one way or the other. I just think it's silly. But it's profitable. Maybe you're right. Maybe what it answers to, but I don't know how popular he is. I haven't seen his work popular with anyone that I wouldn't have expected it to be popular with. That is, people who already like to hear that they should make their beds. So I think that's not where you look. You look rather whether there's a fatigue in general with complacent disbelief, and I have seen that. And the hunger can take many different forms. It can express itself. I mean, it doesn't fit into a single obvious political pattern or social setup. But what it does, what I have seen is more and more students who are students and faculty too, who feel much more comfortable talking about the sense that they're not, that they find the materialist view of reality not only unfulfilling but implausible, that they want more. I have encountered that more in the past 5 years than I had in the previous 15. So I think you may be right about that. Where it will lead, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if we're going to hell in a handbasket. I always tend to think we're already there. See, I don't actually tend to idealize the past. I remember, I'm just old enough to remember a Christian America in which people could go to church on Sunday and then go cast a vote for George Wallace the next couple days later. So I don't have a warm, rosy picture of the Christian America of the past. What I do believe is that the desire for God is a natural eros in the soul that can't be repressed, and that sooner or later it's going to break out in individuals and in whole generations in new ways. And I think you're right. I can only say in a vague way. I'm not sure where it's going, but at least they're no longer intimidated by the new atheists. They don't believe that they enjoy the rational high ground. And I think part of that is there have been very effective answers, not just from me, but from a lot of you who pointed out just how irrational and fideistic and intolerant and rather stupid this movement was.
I was asked a question at Ithaca College about the new atheists, basically, and I do hope that there is this response now, and I think we're seeing it happen, which is not sentimental, it isn't shallow, it involves serious words and new, fresh translations and serious scholarship, and which basically punches the intellectual bullying and the absurd intellectual bullying of the new atheists right back and says, no, they don't occupy the rational high ground. They don't occupy any particularly intellectual or sophisticated ground at all, and all shallows are clear.
Yeah, there's not a single genuinely distinguished philosopher among them. The only trained philosopher is Daniel Dennett, but that's different from saying distinguished. I think a more honest atheist, aware of the relative plausibility of atheism or theism or something as yet to be defined, would be someone like Thomas Nagel, who is unable to believe, doesn't want to believe, has a real revulsion at the idea of belief, as frankly all of us do it at times, but nonetheless recognizes how deep the problems are just at a logical level with the project of a metaphysical naturalism or a physicalism. And I think the veil of illusion has been somewhat pulled back. I think more and more sophisticated answers to the very unsophisticated books that the new atheists produced have made more and more people realize that these are not rationalists, they're just fundamentalists of a particularly dreary and intolerant kind.
Well, that's a good reason to hope. That's a good place to leave it on an Easter episode or an Easter adjacent episode, post-Easter for us, and still in the fasting and penitential period for you.
Yes, well, happy heretic Easter to you.
Listen, I not only get called a heretic for my religion, I get called a heretic for many, many other reasons. So I'm
glad we didn't talk politics. You know.
I did. I will tell the audience. I promised David we would not talk politics. And another reason I don't want to talk politics with David is he's much smarter than I am. So I don't want to even open up that.
Thank you.
The only thing I will suggest, and we won't talk politics online, but because I've so enjoyed your wonderful translation and so much of your writing for years, I could send you my literary magnum opus, which I published last year. But I will send that in the mail. It's much lighter reading.
Blank pages.
It would be the blank pages. That's it. And if perhaps there could be translations, there are ample opportunities. But I will say I probably took a fair bit more out of your translation of the New Testament.
Well, maybe we should talk politics sometime. But the problem is that I'm not, since I dislike both political parties in this country, the major political parties, ferociously. That I only, I abstained so long from voting for the major party that I don't know if I have a right now to complain at the state of affairs that bothered me. But anyway, all right.
I think there are probably a lot of people watching and listening who would agree with that take as well. David, thank you so much for being here. David Bentley Hart, you can read him all over the place. I've been reading him for years, and I really hope the fear with things like a new translation of the New Testament or the writing of a distinguished philosopher and theologian is that it reaches a smaller audience or a more distinguished audience, and I hope many more people will engage with it because the reading can be blissful. David, thank you for being here.
All right, well, thank you. Take care.
We've got to talk about politics. Now that I promised David we wouldn't talk about politics, but now we have to talk about politics, and I've got to sign off. If you are not on dailywire.com, I'm sorry. You cannot get we've gone through all this good news. Now you got to get the bad news, because there's some political bad news, but there's a glimmer of hope in there too. Go to dailywire.com. Why? You get me, you get the Andrew Klavan Show, you get the Ben Shapiro Show. You can subscribe for $10 a month or $100 for an annual membership. That's okay. You get the shows, you get to ask questions in the mailbag, blah, blah, blah. Who cares? No one wants that. This is the real key. This is the real key, folks. The Leftist Tears Tumblr. Now, look, I was without this for a week. I was in New York. I was in one of the lefty capitals of the entire world, and I almost drowned. I made it through by the skin of my teeth. I had straws up, trying to breathe in like people in, war-ravaged countries. Make sure you have the Leftist Tears Tumblr. It's the only FDA-approved device to handle all those salty, delicious leftist tears. We'll be right back with all of the bad political news.